Today we're going to be using this video to learn more about the Holocaust. We know that the Holocaust refers to the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. And we know that some of these groups were arrested and sent to camps for slave labor. We know that some of the other groups that were arrested or considered enemies by the Nazis were the disabled, or also people known as gypsies, including the Roma or the Sinti. The Nazis were a political party in Germany who came to power in 1933, and their leader, Adolf Hitler, was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Soon after they came to power, the Nazis began to target Jews. We're going to be focusing today about the Holocaust from the perspective of these victims and their survivors. And we're first going to learn more about who the victims were before the Nazis came to power by taking a closer look at one of these families. This is a wedding photograph of Seligman and Elsa Buxbaum-Bamberger in Germany in 1921. Their family was Jewish and had lived in Germany for generations. Seligman was a teacher of chemistry at a high school for girls in Hamburg and a devoted leader of his synagogue. What details from the image suggest what life was like for German Jews before the Holocaust? And what do those details suggest? Jews had lived in Germany for centuries and were granted citizenship in 1869. Though Jews were a small minority of Germany, about 1% of German citizens, they practiced their religion freely and without fear. Things would soon change for the Jews in Germany as economic conditions and the political climate changed. In 1933, the Nazis rose to power in a democratic process, and Hitler became chancellor. How do you think Nazi ideas were spread throughout Germany? Maybe you already know some of these ideas and have studied them. The caption of this image, when you take a closer look at all of the pieces, reads, "Here, little one, have a little something sweet, but in order to get it, you both need to come with me." What is this teaching children about Jews? Where do you think you would find an illustration like this one? While anti-Semitism, or the hatred of Jews, had been present in Germany and other European countries for centuries, the influence of the Nazi Party caused it to reach new racial heights during the Holocaust. The Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany's economic problems and their loss in World War I, as well as many other problems in society. Propaganda was used to teach hatred, but there were also laws discriminating against Jews. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were enacted. The Nuremberg Laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship and took away many rights, including prohibiting marriage between Jews and non-Jews. When this book was published in 1938, there was no master plan or final solution to the Jewish question, meaning plans to murder all of Europe's Jews. Yet racial hatred pervaded society and became part of a daily life. The Nazis wanted to force emigration, which is leaving the country, though they enacted many laws that made this very difficult. So they wanted Jews to leave the country, but they made it very difficult for them to leave. Additionally, many German Jews considered Germany their home and they didn't want to leave. Take a closer look at some of these details and see what might create some anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews if a child were to be reading a book like this. Prejudice and discrimination had set the stage for violence. The next photograph documents the first major act of organized violence that the Nazi government led against the Jewish population in Germany. The night of November 9th, 1938, and into the early hours of November 10th, Germans and Austrians carried out anti-Jewish attacks all across the two countries. This was organized by the Nazi Party. At this time, Austria had been annexed by Germany in March 1938, so that's why there were Austrians also committing these attacks. On that night, 91 Jews were murdered, 1,400 synagogues were desecrated, and Jewish shops and homes were destroyed. Some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. That night came to be known as in German as Kristallnacht. Kristall meaning glass and Nacht meaning night. In English, it is sometimes known as the Night of Broken Glass. Kristallnacht was a turning point in the decision-making of German Jews. People who had been thinking this will pass now came to view the situation as dire. About 50% of German Jews left after Kristallnacht. What kind of challenges might they have faced? They left behind their country, family, extended family, almost all their belongings and money. Some didn't have the money to leave, some could not manage the immensely burdensome paperwork. For others, it would have meant leaving behind elderly parents. Many couldn't find countries to accept them, including the United States and England. We've been talking about events in Germany before the war began. Now let's move beyond Germany to see how the Nazis attempted to gain control of Europe and destroy the Jews. This photograph was taken in Poland. Think about what emotions you see on this Jewish man's face. Do you know why it might be particularly humiliating to cut this man's beard? How do you think Nazi efforts at dehumanization of Jews helped spread prejudice and terror? Take a look at the emotion on his face, as well as the emotion of the faces behind his, those people standing against the wall in their uniforms. With the invasion of Poland, the Nazi policy against the Jews changed from emigration to forcing them into ghettos. Confining and isolating the Jews from the rest of society allowed the Nazis to implement their racial policy based on their falsely perceived ideology of Jews being dangerous. These dehumanizing ghettos allowed the Nazis to, 1. Control access to food, money, medicine, and communication with people outside the ghetto, which led to starvation, poverty, disease, and ignorance of what was happening in other places. 2. It allowed the Nazis to take over homes and belongings and give these to German non-Jewish citizens. 3. It allowed Nazis to use the Jews as a workforce, as we can see in this picture. If we look very closely at this man, we can see on his arm, he's got one of those armbands with the Star of David, which was a symbol to show all the Nazis which people were Jews and which people were not. And the last thing it allowed them to do was it allowed the Nazis to move and control the Jewish population in an organized way. Can you imagine what the conditions of a ghetto during World War II were like? While there were thousands and thousands of ghettos and concentration camps, in June 1941, the Nazis enforced new policies and began to organize mass murder by shooting, carried out by mobile killing units, and eventually in killing centers as a final solution to the Jewish question. Before we talk about the final solution, let's take an in-depth look at just one of its victims. These are Benjamin, Jacob, and Sirla. Benjamin was born in 1936, Jacob born in 1928, and Sirla born in 1924. These were children of Noah and Esther Sanier. They were from Warsaw, Poland. Benjamin and Jacob were murdered at Treblinka, along with their mother Esther, and Sirla was murdered at Majdanek. Treblinka and Majdanek were 2 of the 6 killing centers. There were hundreds of concentration camps, but 6 killing centers in German-occupied Poland. They were established to murder Jews as efficiently as possible. Their father Noah survived the war and came to the United States in 1950. Think about the escalation we've learned about so far. Bit by bit, the victims of the Holocaust were stripped of their identities, herded together, taken away, and killed. It's very important to remember the victims as individual people, as their families would remember them, as they lived, not only as they died. It's difficult to imagine the victims as individual people when they're spoken about as the 6 million. This photograph can help bring meaning to the identity of 3 young victims who lost their lives. 1.5 million of the 6 million Jewish victims were children. Why do you think the Nazis would target Jewish children? In late 1941, the Nazi government began to organize mechanized mass murder by deporting Jews from all over Europe to concentration camps and death camps. How did people respond to what was happening? Let's take a look at an example of how some non-Jewish people responded to Nazi domination and persecution of the Jews. This This photo shows an example of how some Jews survived during the Holocaust. Lily Glass, a Jewish girl, was from Belgium. The only way her family felt they could survive was to split up. Many Jewish parents were incredibly resourceful in finding places for their families to hide. Her twin brothers were placed in an orphanage, her mother hid in a farmhouse, and her father had been evacuated to England with the Belgian army. Lily was hidden in a convent by Roman Catholic nuns. She's the tall girl on the far left. None of the family knew if they would see each other again. Why might someone decide to be a rescuer? And what kind of consequences might they face if they were caught? Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Research Center in Israel, has honored more than 27,000 non-Jews who risked their lives to rescue or aid Jews in the Holocaust. However, millions of people all over the world did nothing. How did Jews in Europe respond to what was happening to them? What kinds of resistance did Jews organize? What do we mean when we talk about defiance or resistance during wartime? What can we see in this photo? Can you tell the mood in the people's expressions? Despite hunger, isolation, and a lack of weapons, some Jews did the best they could to forcibly resist the Nazis. In addition to armed or physical resistance, there's a resistance of another nature. Sometimes it's called spiritual resistance, though it includes more than actions of a spiritual or religious nature. Some examples of spiritual resistance are practicing one's religion even though it's forbidden, forming strong friendships and helping each other through hard times, helping people find hiding places, forging papers, or sabotage. With the end of World War II in 1945 came liberation by the Allies meaning the Americans, Canadians, the British, and the Russians. What do you think happened to the Jews when the war ended? What did they do? This was the first baby born after the war in the Gabber-See displaced persons camp. We'll discuss what that means soon, but first let's talk about what the challenges were that the survivors faced after the war ended. There's a little baby. Those who survived had to figure out how to restart their lives. Many people had been separated from their families, and many had to begin their new lives without the family and communities they once had. For Jewish survivors, liberation was a bittersweet experience. Some returned to their hometowns where they witnessed destruction. Often their pre-war homes had been destroyed or taken over, and many Jews faced ongoing hatred. It was very difficult to contact relatives, and it was after a war, and people had been displaced all over Europe. Many stayed for years in displaced persons camps that were established by the Allies. In the camps, marriage and birth rates were high, as survivors struggled to rebuild their lives and families. The State of Israel was founded in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, and 2/3 of the survivors chose to emigrate there. Many also went to the United States, but Jews also settled in many other places after the Holocaust, including Austria, Sweden, South Africa, and Canada. Your final activity is to write 3 facts you learned today, 2 facts you found interesting, and 1 question you still have.